The wind rolled through the plains like a restless spirit, carrying dust across the lonely town of Red Creek. It was the kind of place where the sun bleached the wooden storefronts and the wind never quite stopped whispering. A town of hard men, worn boots, and quiet regrets. The year was 1876. Outside the Silver Spur Saloon, a tall cowboy leaned against a post, his hat tipped low against the blazing afternoon sun. His name was Caleb Turner, and folks in Red Creek knew him as a man who didn't talk much but kept his word like it was written in stone. Caleb owned a modest cattle ranch just outside town. 50 head of cattle, 2 ranch hands, and a stubborn Mustang named Dust Devil were the only company he'd had for years, until today. Caleb pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket again. The edges were worn from weeks of rereading. A letter. Mr. Caleb Turner, I am willing to travel west and become your wife. I seek an honest man and a quiet life. I have known hardship, but I believe the frontier offers new beginnings. Respectfully, Clara Whitmore, mail order bride. The idea had seemed simple when he placed the advertisement in a newspaper back east, but now the train whistle echoed across the prairie, and Caleb felt something unfamiliar, nervous. The train rolled into Red Creek like a steel thunderstorm, steam hissing as it slowed beside the small wooden platform. Townsfolk gathered out of curiosity. Mail order brides were rare here. Most women who came west knew exactly what kind of men waited for them, but this one. She stepped off the train slowly, and everything went quiet. She wore a pale blue dress that looked too delicate for the dust and wind of Red Creek. Her dark hair was tied neatly beneath a traveling bonnet. A small leather suitcase hung from her hand, but it was her eyes that caught Caleb's attention. Wide, uneasy, fearful, she scanned the platform like someone expecting trouble to appear at any moment. Caleb pushed away from the post and walked toward her. His boots thudded softly against the wooden planks. When she noticed him approaching, she straightened, but her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. Caleb removed his hat politely. Miss Whitmore? Her breath caught. Yes. Are you Caleb Turner? For a moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the hem of her dress. Then Caleb noticed something else. Her hands were trembling, not the nervous excitement of a woman meeting her future husband. No, this was something deeper, like she'd run a long way and wasn't sure she'd escaped. Caleb spoke gently. You all right, ma'am? Clara forced a small smile. I suppose I am, but her eyes darted briefly toward the train, like she expected someone else to step off. Caleb followed her gaze. The train doors closed. Passengers disappeared inside the cars. No one was watching them. Still, the fear in her eyes lingered. He picked up her suitcase before she could protest. Reckon you've had a long journey. I have. Well, he said calmly. Red Creek ain't much to look at, but it's quiet. Quiet's a good thing out here. She nodded. Yes, I hoped it might be. They walked slowly down the dusty street. The town looked exactly like Clara must have imagined. The Wild Westwood, horses tied to rail posts, men in worn coats and gun belts, the faint sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. A wagon creaked past, carrying sacks of grain. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder. Caleb noticed. You expecting someone? She hesitated. No, but the answer came too quickly. He didn't press. They stopped outside the general store, where Caleb's horse waited. Dust Devil snorted impatiently. Clara stared at the animal. He's large. Caleb chuckled softly. That's 'cause he's a horse. Her lips twitched slightly, the first hint of humor. Caleb helped her mount behind the saddle. She hesitated before placing her hands lightly around his waist. He could feel the tension in her grip. They rode out of town toward the ranch. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction. Golden grass rippled beneath the wind. The sky burned orange as the sun began to sink. Clara stared in quiet wonder. It's beautiful. Caleb nodded. First time seeing land like this? Yes. She fell silent for a moment, Then she spoke softly. It feels like the world forgot this place exists. Caleb smiled faintly. Sometimes, that's the best kind of place to live. They reached the ranch as twilight settled over the plains, a simple wooden house, a barn, a few fenced pastures, nothing fancy, but it was home. Caleb helped her down from the horse. She looked around slowly. You built all this yourself? Piece by piece, Clara nodded thoughtfully. Then something strange happened. Her shoulders relaxed, just a little, like the weight she carried had eased slightly. Caleb opened the door. You hungry? A little. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. Clara stepped in carefully, like she wasn't used to safe places. They sat at the small table while Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee. The lantern light flickered softly. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Caleb said quietly, "You ain't gotta be scared here." She looked up, surprised. "I'm not." "You got fear in your eyes since the moment you stepped off that train." Her breath caught. The room went still. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "Steady, whatever you ran from. It ain't here." Her eyes filled suddenly with tears she clearly didn't want to show. He continued gently, "And whatever comes looking for you." He rested his hand on the table. "I'll handle it." Clara stared at him. Something in those words shifted inside her. For the first time since she arrived, the fear in her eyes softened. But far away on the darkening plains, a group of riders watched the ranch house from the distant hills, and their leader said coldly, "She's here." His hand rested on the grip of his revolver. "Find her." Morning came to the Turner Ranch with the sound of wind brushing across the prairie grass and the low, patient calls of cattle beyond the fence. Clara Whitmore woke slowly. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. The room felt unfamiliar. Wooden walls, a small window glowing with sunrise, the faint scent of coffee drifting from somewhere beyond the door. Then the memory returned. The train, Red Creek, Caleb Turner, her husband. She sat up in the bed carefully, smoothing her dress where it hung over the chair. The quiet felt strange. Back east, the city was never silent. Carriages rattled past, people shouted, doors slammed. But here, the silence felt wide and endless. Clara walked to the window. Outside, the prairie stretched in golden waves under the rising sun. A few cattle grazed lazily in the distance. The barn stood beside the house like a patient old guardian, and in the yard, Caleb Turner worked. He moved with quiet strength as he filled a trough with water. Sleeves rolled up, hat tilted against the morning glare. Dust Devil stood nearby, pawing the ground impatiently. Clara watched him for a moment. There was something steady about him, something solid, a man built by the land he lived on. She realized then that it had been years since she had felt even a hint of safety. A knock came at the door. "Coffee's ready," Caleb called. She stepped outside a few minutes later. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and hay. Caleb sat on the porch with 2 cups already poured. He gestured toward the empty chair. "Morning, good." "Morning," she replied softly. She sat carefully. The coffee was strong, bitter, but warm. For a while, they simply watched the sunrise. Finally Caleb spoke. "Ranch life starts early. I noticed. You ever been on a ranch before?" "No, you'll learn quick." Clara gave a small smile. "I hope so." "I'd hate to be useless." Caleb chuckled. "Ain't many useless folks out here. Just folks who ain't learned yet." After breakfast, Caleb showed her the ranch. The barn smelled of hay and leather. Saddles hung neatly along the wall. Tools rested in organized rows. 2 ranch hands were already working. The taller one tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am, Clara," Caleb said. "This is Hank." Hank grinned. "Pleasure." The younger man beside him nodded. Shyly, "Tom." Clara greeted them both. They seemed curious about her but respectful. Caleb handed her a small bucket. "Think you can help gather eggs?" Clara blinked. "From chickens? Unless you know another creature that lays eggs." She laughed softly. and for the first time since arriving in Red Creek, the sound felt natural. Days passed slowly at the ranch. Clara learned how to collect eggs, mend shirts, and cook meals that didn't burn. She watched Caleb work long hours in the sun repairing fences, tending cattle, training horses. He rarely complained, but she noticed the weariness in his shoulders by evening. One afternoon, Caleb brought Dust Devil to the yard. "You ever ride?" Clara shook her head. "Never." "Well," he said, "time to change that." She stared at the horse uncertainly. "He looks temperamental, only if he thinks you're scared." She crossed her arms. "That seems unfair." Caleb smiled faintly. Horses got a way of reading people. He helped her into the saddle carefully. Dust Devil shifted beneath her. Clara stiffened. "Relax." Caleb said calmly. "I am relaxed. You look like you're sitting on dynamite." She exhaled slowly. Caleb took the reins and began leading the horse gently around the yard, step by step. Clara's posture loosened. The wind brushed through her hair as the horse moved. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the fence, and for the first time since leaving the train, Clara felt something new, freedom. When they stopped, she looked down at Caleb. "That wasn't terrible." High praise. They laughed. A few days later, Caleb took her into town. Red Creek buzzed with its usual rough energy. Men argued over carts outside the saloon. Wagons rolled through the street. The blacksmith's hammer rang against metal. Clara stayed close to Caleb. He noticed, "Town ain't dangerous in daylight." "I know." Still, her eyes scanned the street carefully. They stepped inside the general store. The owner greeted Caleb warmly. "Well, I'll be. You finally brought her." Clara smiled politely. After gathering supplies, they walked back outside, but halfway down the street, Clara froze. Her hand tightened on Caleb's arm. "Clara?" She stared toward the far end of town. 3 men stood beside the saloon, dusty coats, hard faces, watching. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Caleb." He followed her gaze. "Do you know them?" Clara's lips trembled slightly. "Yes." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What do they want?" Her answer came barely above a breath. "Me." Before Caleb could speak, one of the men began walking toward them. Slow, confident, dangerous. Caleb's hand drifted instinctively toward the revolver at his side. Clara grabbed his arm. "Please, don't." The man stopped a few feet away. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Well now," he said, "looks like we found you." Clara, the street suddenly felt very quiet. Caleb stepped slightly in front of her. "Who are you?" The stranger tipped his hat. "Name's Victor Hale." His eyes flicked toward Clara. Her husband. Clara's face went pale, and Caleb felt the world shift beneath his boots, because suddenly, everything he thought he knew about his mail-order bride was a lie. The wind carried dust down the main street of Red Creek as the town seemed to pause and watch. Victor Hale stood there with the confidence of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. Tall, sharp jaw, black coat worn like a badge of authority. A silver revolver rested comfortably at his hip. Behind him, the 2 men Clara had noticed earlier leaned lazily against the saloon porch, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. Caleb Turner didn't move, but the air between the 2 men felt like the seconds before lightning strikes. "Her husband?" Caleb repeated, his voice low. Victor smiled thinly. "That's right." Clara stepped out from behind Caleb suddenly. "No." Her voice trembled but carried enough strength to turn heads across the street. "You are not my husband." Victor chuckled. "Funny thing about marriage, Clara, it don't stop being real just because you run away." A murmur rippled through the small crowd forming near the saloon. Clara's hands clenched into fists. "You forced that marriage." Victor tilted his head slightly. "Legal is legal." Caleb's voice cut in. "She says it ain't." Victor looked back at him, finally giving Caleb his full attention. "And who might you be?" "Caleb Turner." Victor studied him briefly, then laughed softly. "The cowboy she ran to hide behind." Clara spoke again, louder this time. I didn't come here to hide. Victor's eyes darkened. No. You came here to steal something that belongs to me. Caleb's jaw tightened. People ain't property. Victor's smile vanished. In my world, he said coldly. They are. The tension thickened like a storm cloud. Caleb stepped forward slightly, placing himself firmly between Victor and Clara. She's staying here. Victor laughed again. But there was no humor in it. You think this dusty little town protects her? He gestured around them. You know who I am? Caleb's eyes never left his. Don't care. That answer clearly irritated Victor. He stepped closer. Name's Victor Hale. I run half the rail trade between Kansas City and Denver. A few townsfolk exchanged uneasy looks. Victor continued, and I don't take kindly to people stealing from me. Clara's voice cracked. I didn't steal anything. You stole my wife. I escaped. You. Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. You signed papers. You stood before a preacher. I was threatened. You were married. Caleb finally spoke again. Don't matter. She ain't going with you. Victor studied Caleb carefully now, like a predator deciding whether a fight was worth the effort. Then he smiled again. You really believe that? Caleb didn't answer. Victor turned slowly, looking around Red Creek. Nice little town you got here. He nodded toward the saloon. Would be a shame if trouble found its way here. The threat hung in the air. Clara stepped forward quickly. Victor, please. He looked at her. You come with me now. And no one gets hurt. Caleb spoke quietly. That ain't happening. Victor sighed. I was hoping we could avoid unpleasantness. His hand hovered near his revolver. Instantly, Caleb's hand mirrored the movement. The entire street froze. Even the wind seemed to stop, but after a long moment, Victor slowly lifted both hands away from his gun. Not today, he said. Calmly, he stepped backward. This town ain't worth the mess. He glanced once more at Clara. But I'll be back for you, then. He turned and walked toward the saloon. His two men followed. The crowd slowly began to disperse. Clara stood there shaking. Caleb turned to her. You all right? Tears filled her eyes. I'm sorry. For what? For lying. Caleb sighed quietly. Figured there was something you weren't saying. She looked down. I didn't know where else to go. He studied her face, the fear, the exhaustion, the quiet desperation. What exactly are we dealing with here? He asked. Clara hesitated. Then the truth finally came. My father owed Victor Hale money. Caleb frowned. He was a banker. His investments failed. Victor offered to erase the debt if I married him, and you agreed. I had no choice. Her voice broke. He's cruel, Caleb. You don't understand. Caleb's jaw tightened. He hurt you? She didn't answer, but the silence said enough. Caleb looked toward the saloon where Victor had disappeared, then back at Clara. You ain't going back to him. Her eyes widened. You don't know what he's capable of. I know men like him, and Caleb's voice was steady. They bleed same as anyone else. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You're talking about fighting a man who commands hired guns and railroad money. Caleb shrugged slightly. I've faced worse. She searched his face. But why? She whispered. You barely know me. Caleb looked out toward the endless prairie, then back at her. Because no one deserves to live scared. For a moment Clara couldn't speak. Then suddenly a gunshot echoed from inside the saloon. The entire town jolted. A man burst through the swinging doors yelling, "They shot Hank!" Caleb's blood ran cold, because Hank had come to town earlier that morning, and now Victor Hale had just made his first move. Caleb grabbed Clara's hand. Stay behind me. They ran toward the saloon, and Red Creek was about to learn just how dangerous Victor Hale truly was. The inside of the saloon smelled of whiskey, smoke, and fear. When Caleb pushed through the swinging doors, he saw Hank sprawled beside the poker table, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his shirt, dripping onto the wooden floorboards. Tom knelt beside him, pressing a rag against the wound. "Hold still," Tom muttered nervously, across the room. Victor Hale leaned against the bar like nothing unusual had happened. One of his men casually spun a revolver in his hand. The piano player had stopped mid-note. Every eye turned toward Caleb. His voice came out low and dangerous. "What happened?" Tom looked up. They were asking questions about Clara. "Hank told them to leave town." Hank groaned. "One of them didn't like that answer." Victor sipped his whiskey. "You should teach your ranch hands better manners." Turner Caleb took a slow step forward. "You shot him." Victor shrugged. "Just a warning." Clara stepped inside behind Caleb and gasped when she saw Hank. Victor noticed her immediately. "Well now," he said softly. "There you are." Caleb's hand hovered near his revolver. The room felt like a match waiting for a spark, but before anything could explode, the town sheriff pushed through the crowd. Sheriff Walter Briggs was an older man with a thick mustache and tired eyes. "What in God's name is going on?" Victor smiled politely, misunderstanding. Briggs looked at Hank bleeding on the floor. "Looks like more than that." Victor raised his hands calmly. "My associate was insulted." Things escalated. Caleb's voice cut in. "You call shooting a man escalation?" Victor glanced at him. "I call it frontier justice." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Victor, you and your boys will leave town tonight." Victor tilted his head. "Or," Briggs rested a hand on his own revolver, "or I lock you up." For a moment it looked like Victor might argue. Then he chuckled. "Very well." He set his glass down. "Tonight," as he walked past Caleb, he paused just long enough to whisper, "This isn't over." Then Victor and his men stepped outside. The tension in the room slowly loosened. Tom helped Hank stand. "You're lucky," Caleb said. "Bullet went clean through." Hank grunted. "Still hurts like hell." Clara rushed forward. "I'll help clean the wound." Caleb watched her carefully. Her hands moved with surprising confidence as she wrapped Hank's shoulder. "You've done this before, Caleb?" said. Clara nodded quietly. "My father's bank was robbed once. I helped the doctor treat the wounded." Caleb studied her again. There was far more to Clara Whitmore than he had first imagined. But even as the saloon calmed down, a feeling settled deep in Caleb's chest. Victor Hale wasn't the type of man who left quietly. That night, the ranch lay beneath a sky full of cold stars. Crickets chirped in the tall grass. The wind whispered across the prairie. Inside the house, Clara sat at the table while Caleb cleaned his rifle. The lantern light flickered between them. Finally she spoke. "You shouldn't fight him." Caleb didn't look up. "He started this." "No," she said softly. "I did." He paused. "You ran from a monster, and now that monster will destroy everything you've built." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Let him try." Clara's voice cracked. "You don't understand Victor. He ruins people, towns, businesses, anyone who stands against him." Caleb studied her face. The fear was back, but now there was something else too. Guilt. He spoke gently. "You think you brought trouble here?" "I did." He shook his head. "Trouble was already part of this land. You just gave it a name." She looked down at the table. "What if someone gets killed because of me?" Caleb's voice softened. "Then we face it together." The words hung between them. Clara looked up slowly. Something unspoken passed through the silence, a connection deeper than the agreement that had brought her west. But before either could say anything, more dust devils suddenly whinnied loudly outside. Then came another sound. Hooves. Fast. Caleb's eyes snapped toward the window. "That ain't good." He stood and grabbed his rifle. Clara followed him. Outside, across the dark prairie, several torches moved toward the ranch like fiery ghosts. Riders. Least 6 of them. Caleb cursed under his breath. Victor didn't wait until morning. The riders reached the fence and jumped it easily. One of them threw a flaming bottle toward the barn. Glass shattered. Fire exploded across the dry wood, the barn ignited. Instantly, Clara gasped, "No." Caleb fired his rifle. One rider dropped from his horse, the others scattered, firing back. Bullets tore into the ranch house walls. "Get inside," Caleb shouted, but Clara didn't move. The barn roared with flames. The horses inside screamed in panic. "They'll burn," she cried. Caleb hesitated only a second, then he ran straight toward the fire. Smoke billowed into the night as the barn roof crackled. Clara's heart pounded as she watched him disappear into the flames. Gunshots echoed around the ranch. Riders circled like wolves, and inside the burning barn, Caleb fought to free the terrified horses, but the roof beams were already beginning to collapse. Outside, Clara grabbed the rifle Caleb had dropped. Her hands trembled, but when one of Victor's riders galloped toward the house, she raised the gun and fired. The rider fell. For a moment, the attackers hesitated, then they turned and rode off into the darkness. The ranch fell silent except for the roaring fire. Clara dropped the rifle. "Caleb." Smoke poured from the barn. Seconds passed. Then suddenly Caleb burst through the flames, leading two horses out into the yard. Dust Devil followed close behind. Clara ran toward him. "You're alive." He coughed, covered in soot. "Barn's gone." The roof collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks. Clara looked at the burning wreckage. Her voice trembled. "I'm so sorry." Caleb stared into the flames. "Victor." Hale had just crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Caleb loaded another round into his rifle. His voice was colder than Clara had ever heard it. "Tomorrow." He looked toward the distant darkness where the riders had disappeared. "I end this." Clara felt a chill run down her spine, because tomorrow someone in Red Creek was going to die. Dawn broke over the prairie like a blade of fire across the horizon. What had once been the Turner Ranch barn now stood as a blackened skeleton against the morning sky. Thin curls of smoke still rose from the charred wood. The smell of ash lingered in the air. Clara hadn't slept. She sat on the porch steps wrapped in a blanket, watching Caleb in the yard. He was saddling Dust Devil. Every movement was calm, deliberate, quiet, the kind of quiet that came before violence. Clara stood slowly. "You're going into town." Caleb didn't deny it. "Victor's there." "Then I'll come." Caleb shook his head. "Immediately." "No, I won't hide while you risk your life for me." He paused, tightening the saddle strap. "This ain't about you hiding." "Then what is it?" He turned to face her. "It's about me making sure you live long enough to enjoy this ranch." Her eyes filled with emotion. "You talk like you're not planning to come back." Caleb gave a faint smile. "Planning and reality ain't always the same." Clara walked closer. "Victor won't face you fairly. He'll bring men." "I know. And you're still going." "Yep." She searched his face. "You're stubborn." "So I've been told." For a long moment neither spoke. The prairie wind brushed through Clara's hair. Finally she said quietly, "If you die, this is my fault." Caleb shook his head. "No, it's Victor's, but you're the one riding toward danger." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "That's what cowboys do." Her voice cracked. "You barely know me." He steadied her eyes. "No." "Enough." Clara swallowed hard. "Why?" Caleb thought about the question. Then he answered honestly, "Because the moment you stepped off that train, I saw someone who deserved better than fear." Her breath trembled. "Caleb." He stepped closer. "If something happens to me, you ride west. Sheriff Briggs will help you." Her voice broke. "Don't say that." He tipped his hat slightly, just being practical. Then he mounted Dust Devil. Clara stood frozen. "Caleb Turner." He paused. She walked up beside the horse, and before she could lose her courage, she kissed him. It was sudden, desperate, real. When she stepped back, tears filled her eyes. "Come back." Caleb nodded once, then he turned the horse and rode toward Red Creek. The town was tense when Caleb arrived. Word had already spread about the barn fire. People watched from windows and doorways as he rode down the dusty street. Sheriff Briggs stood outside his office, mourning. The sheriff said, "Caleb dismounted. You know why I'm here?" Briggs sighed. "Victor Hale checked into the hotel last night. With how many men?" "6. Caleb nodded. "Figures." The sheriff studied him carefully. "You planning to start a war in my town?" "No, then what?" Caleb looked down the street, ending one, before Briggs could stop him. Caleb walked toward the hotel. The wooden boardwalk creaked beneath his boots. Inside the hotel lobby, Victor Hale sat comfortably in a chair reading a newspaper. His men stood nearby. Victor looked up. "Well now," he folded the paper slowly. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Caleb stopped a few feet away. "You burned my barn." Victor shrugged. "You refused my offer." "What offer?" "Return my wife." Clara's name hung between them like a loaded gun. Caleb spoke firmly. "She ain't your wife." Victor sighed. "Legally she is." Caleb's hand hovered near his revolver. "Not anymore." Victor leaned forward slightly. "You think killing me fixes this?" Caleb's eyes hardened. "Only one way to find out." The room went silent. Victor slowly stood. His men shifted nervously. Then Victor raised a hand. "No." They stopped. Victor walked toward the door. "Let's not make a mess." Indoors, they stepped outside. The entire town seemed to gather. Along the street, Caleb and Victor faced each other in the dust, 20 feet apart. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward reluctantly. "This ain't legal." Victor smiled. "Neither was burning a barn." Briggs sighed. "Fine, but keep it clean." The wind blew through Red Creek. A tumbleweed rolled slowly across the street. Victor rested his hand near his revolver. Caleb mirrored the movement. The world narrowed to a single moment. Victor spoke softly. "You know, Clara was supposed to make my life easier." Caleb said nothing, "But now she's caused me a great deal of trouble." Caleb's voice was calm. "She's free." Victor laughed. "No one is free." Then both men moved. 2 guns flashed. 2 shots cracked through the air. Victor Hale staggered. He looked down at the dark stains spreading across his chest. Then he collapsed into the dust. The street erupted with noise. Victor's men froze. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward with his rifle. "Drop your guns." They obeyed. Caleb stood still, smoke rising from his revolver. The war was over, but the story wasn't finished, because back at the ranch Clara Whitmore waited, not knowing if the man she had begun to love was still alive. The sun had climbed halfway into the sky by the time Caleb Turner rode back toward his ranch. Dust Devil moved at an easy pace, hooves thudding softly against the prairie earth. The wind carried the smell of grass and distant rain, but Caleb barely noticed it. His mind kept returning to one moment. Clara kissing him. It had been quick, unexpected, but it had changed something. He touched the brim of his hat thoughtfully. The gunfight replayed in his head too. Victor Hale's surprised expression, the echo of the gunshot, the heavy silence after the man hit the dirt. Caleb had faced danger before, cattle rustlers, outlaws, even a mountain lion once, but this fight had been different. This one had been for someone, for Clara. Ahead, the ranch slowly came into view. The burned remains of the barn still stood black against the horizon like the bones of a fallen giant. Caleb sighed. Rebuilding would take time, but ranchers understood one truth about the frontier: everything worth having required rebuilding. He rode closer. Then he saw her. Clara stood near the fence, staring down the trail. She had clearly been waiting for hours. The moment she recognized Caleb, she froze. For a second, she looked like she might collapse from relief. Then she ran, her dress gathered in her hands as she sprinted across the dirt yard. Caleb barely had time to dismount before she reached him. "Caleb." She threw her arms around him. He caught her instinctively. "You're alive." Her voice trembled against his chest. I thought. Caleb held her gently. It's over. She leaned back, searching his face. What happened? Victor won't bother you again. Her eyes widened. You killed him. Caleb nodded once. Clara looked down for a moment, not with grief, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had lived under a tyrant's shadow. When she looked back up, tears shimmered in her eyes. I didn't want bloodshed because of me. Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face. Sometimes evil doesn't stop until someone stands up to it. Clara studied him. You risked your life. He shrugged slightly. Seemed worth it. She looked around the ranch, the ruined barn, the frightened horses still wandering near the fence. You lost so much. Caleb shook his head. Barn can be rebuilt. Her voice softened. And what about us? The question lingered in the quiet air. For the first time since she arrived in Red Creek, Clara didn't look afraid. She looked hopeful. Caleb leaned against the fence, thinking. When I sent that advertisement for a mail-order bride, he said slowly, I figured I'd end up with a stranger. Clara smiled faintly. You did? Yeah. He looked out across the endless prairie, but somewhere between that train platform and last night's fire, he turned back to her. You stopped being a stranger. Clara's heart seemed to skip. Caleb. He spoke honestly. I don't know much about fancy words or romance. That's all right. But I do know this. He stepped closer. When I thought about riding into town today, the only thing that scared me was the idea of you being alone out here. Her eyes filled with emotion. And that means something. Clara laughed softly through her tears. Yes, she whispered, it does. They stood together in the warm sunlight. The prairie stretched forever in every direction. Finally Clara said, you know, I never planned to fall in love with the man I was sent to marry. Caleb smirked slightly. You saying you have? She stepped closer until their boots nearly touched. Very much. Caleb chuckled quietly. Well then, he tipped his hat. Guess? That makes this the most successful mail order arrangement in the history of the West. She smiled. Possibly. Then she kissed him again. But this time it wasn't desperate. It was slow, certain, and full of promise. Months later spring arrived across the prairie. Wildflowers dotted the grasslands like scattered paint. The new barn stood strong and tall where the burned one once had been. Hank's shoulder healed. Tom bragged constantly about the time Clara shot a rider off his horse, and Red Creek slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. But the biggest change happened one warm afternoon. Beneath a massive oak tree near the ranch house, a small group of townsfolk gathered. Sheriff Briggs stood beside Hank and Tom. Clara wore a simple white dress. Caleb stood beside her, looking slightly uncomfortable in a clean shirt. The preacher cleared his throat. Caleb Turner, do you take Clara Whitmore to be your wife? Caleb looked at her, but this time there was no contract. No arrangement. No fear in her eyes. Just love. I do. The preacher smiled. And Clara Whitmore, do you take Caleb Turner to be your husband? Clara squeezed Caleb's hand. With all my heart. The preacher nodded. Then by the power vested in me. He grinned. You two can stop pretending and get on with being married. Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Caleb kissed her. The prairie wind rolled gently across the land, and somewhere beyond the hills, a hawk soared beneath the endless sky. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Red Creek with fear in her eyes, but the cowboy's words had changed everything, and on that wild frontier, their love became the kind of story people told for generations. The story of the mail-order bride who found freedom, and the cowboy who gave her a reason to believe in it.